Okay, so welcome to our next edition of the Next Level podcast, our regular discussion and insights on all things that will take your organisation, your teams and your leadership to the next level. Going to be focusing today, but actually not just today, but over the next few podcasts on sales and more importantly, sales leadership. So I'm Jason Langford-Brown, I'm the Director of Circle and Head of Europe of Sales Shift, and delighted to have with me today founder and CEO of Sales Shift, Mike Boyle, joining us from sunny Melbourne. Good to see you, Mike.
G'day, Jason. How are you?
Yeah, all good, all good. And excited, Mike, about today because we've talked a lot. I think probably I was reflecting on this yesterday since about 2008 and probably that sort of accelerated in 2013 when we did our Sales Shift 2020 white paper about the kind of the shift in sales, particularly in B2B, and how what was working doesn't work anymore and what we need to do to sell more effectively. So we've done lots of stuff, I think, since 2013 right up to today. But I think, excited about today because we're going to go really back in time. Back to 1894, father of, and probably inventor of professional sales, John Patterson. And I think this is really important, because I think what we're finding out, we're recording this in the time of coronavirus, but it's really, really, for me, fascinating looking at Patterson and some of the things he was doing back in 1894, and how much of that, as human beings, we're really, really good at kind of working out the right way to do things and then forgetting. And I think a lot of that wisdom of Patterson's been lost. So I think it's really great. We're going to go back and look at some of that stuff, which I think people are going to find really valuable. So I think to bring you back in, Mike, what I want to hear from you today is kind of most people won't have heard of Patterson, let alone his business. But so who was he and why is he so important to us?
Well, thanks for sort of setting this up. I'm pretty excited about this because we're about to go back and really revisit what I would consider the father of selling. If there's a Yoda using Star Wars sort of theme, he's the Yoda. He's the bloke that sort of started it in any formal way. And when we look back in history, selling's been happening since, early religious days. So that part of selling came up through the missionaries, of course, going out into the New World and all that sort of stuff. And then the drummers of the Midwest of America that drummed up business and, got people to respond back to a warehouse sort of situation. But it wasn't until about 1850, 1860 that some real formalised sales stuff started to come together. And we can now see that John R. Patterson was the founder of that. And it was in sort of around 1894 that he really put his sort of foot in the ground around sales. He'd come out of the coal business in Daytona, Ohio. He and his brother had sort of worked through a coal distribution business, and they sort of wanted to get out of that. But he had a stake in another little business, which was owned by another guy called James Ritty. And they had this cash register, this machine. It was an Austrian-German sort of technology that they brought out. But it was very unsuccessful. They really hadn't had much scope, hadn't got anything done. But he wasn't focused on it. But suddenly Patterson had money and he had time. So he said, I'm going to get involved in this little business and find out how it works. And of course, what he discovered was pretty unprofessional, pretty ad hoc sort of way of moving a machine. And so he put his toe deep in it and bought the whole business off the founder. And that started National Cash Register. And that's where it all started. And he then set about building a business. And I think we'll go through the sort of history today and over the coming months in these podcasts, because I think there's a fabulous, what did history tell us about what he did? What do we do today? But I think ironically now, post-COVID or during COVID, some of the things that we saw in 1890s that he perfected are now going to come really important again, like relationships, like solution selling in its true form, like problem solving and the power of problem solving with clients. The other thing we've got to remember here is he was the first to do direct mail marketing. He actually built the business around this incredible form of simplified direct mail. He was the first to do consultative selling. There is no doubt about that. Anywhere you look at the consultative framework. He was the first to do formal sales training, the first to do quota, territory, call planning, sales planning, all the things that we see today in sales, in some organisations and not in others. He founded that. He was the first to do this, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. So there's just a wonderful history here, Jason.
Yeah, no, and I think just picking up on a couple of things you said there, Mike. I think I didn't, and I talk about him in a sales context, but I think he didn't just invent direct mail. I think what he was incredible at was actually using multiple marketing mediums and creating a mix of those together that then had results. So if we were driving this on a marketing conversation, there's a huge piece of respect for him around how he not just created and invented some forms of marketing, but how he brought marketing channels together and made them work together to get great results. Definitely. And I think that thing, interesting leads into how, and this is something you and I talked about a lot, is actually how he was integrating marketing with sales. They weren't separate functions that operated differently. They worked together hand in hand to get results.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Comment on that, because that's just an interesting.
Yeah, I think. Well, what he perfected, he knew with the original business that he had to create leads, as we do today. He wanted to create some sort of form of lead generation. He knew traditionally the business that he bought, they would go sort of to a merchant, they'd sell a cash register, and then they'd hope that that merchant would tell his mates and sell another one and sell another one. But it fabulously didn't work. And of course, it didn't give them leverage and width to grow. So he said, I've got to do this differently. And you got to remember the style of the man. He was very dictatorial. I don't think he was a very pleasant man to be around by the sound of it. Very dictatorial, very hard. He would hire slow, sack really fast. So if you didn't get your sort of stuff together quickly, you'd be out. He was very, very hard on his men. And you see the photos of, the training camps and all that. It was all men. There was no women involved in those days, of course. So he built this sort of program, but he couldn't get the scope to get going. And that's when he started to play with advertising. He believed that if he could send a message out to people and they could connect with it, that people would then show interest in his brand. And this is in the early days of marketing and advertising, of course. But then he went to the next level. He actually advertised to bridge a gap around a problem. So one of his famous campaigns was, "Do you have a receipt for that?" One headline, "Do you have a receipt?" Well, of course, no one did, because they didn't have cash registers. They didn't get these receipts. So suddenly he put this, well, what if you had a receipt in people's mind? And of course they responded, and the merchants responded, and suddenly the sales rate. But that then uncovered another problem. He started to get more leads than he could handle because his sales force were no bloody good. So that's what then developed out what we know today as Sugar Camp. So, through this need to then satisfy and prospect the leads that he suddenly was getting, he had to develop the skills of the salespeople. He had to train them. Now, there was no sales training formalised in those days. Like, we didn't get the Red Motleys of the world or that sort of stuff till the 30s, the 1930s. So this was very early days. So he set up tents on a farm that he owned called Sugar Camp. And so there was hundreds and hundreds of tents that they put and big marquees for training halls. And he started to build systemization around the sales. And that led to the document called the Primer. And this was a 450-page document that documented the way he wanted people to sell, the things he wanted them to do, the hand language he wanted them to use, the body language, the style, the interaction. Everything was documented in this how-to guide. And sitting here with me, I've got a copy of it, because buying an actual original primer is almost impossible. They're very rare. But the guys in Daytona Museum, at NCR Museum, arranged a copy for me. So I've got a copy here, and it's quite incredible material that I've collected. So that sort of led to the primer.
Yeah, I just want to I'm going to come back to some of those things in a bit more detail. I think just going back to what you said about, his advertising, I think, that for me, that just resonates. People don't care what you do, it's why am I listening to what you're going to do for me. So still far too many salespeople, even in 2020, selling stuff rather than selling to a problem, which I think, whether you look at Elmer Wheeler, all these other great sales people of history, they've always said that, but incredible for me, probably still 80% of the salespeople I come across and their leaders still sell stuff and not to a problem. So I think just that's a really important point. But just getting back to Sugar Camp, and I think for me, what we're starting to touch on here at Patterson is, for me, he's the guy that made sales professional. He professionalized sales, and I think as you highlighted, not only did he have too many leads, he also had a sales force that incredibly unprofessional. So he had to upskill them, but also make them more professional. And then, you know, what we start to see then is Patterson recognised there was a science behind it. It wasn't some kind of black art that some people are born with, as you said at the beginning of this discussion. So yeah, just want to expand on kind of, you know, for you, how he went about, you know, creating this science and what Sugar Camp then did to facilitate that.
So there's a great statement. I've got some statements that he's made here. One of the statements he's made, 1/2 of our salesmen are so ignorant of their product that they will actually prevent a man from buying, even though he wanted a cash register, he said. Like, yeah, that's a quote from Patterson. So he looked at these salespeople and they had it wrong. They took it because of their product knowledge. And Jason, we see this today. They took their product knowledge and used that as their sales anchor, an anchor for the conversation. I have knowledge about something you don't have knowledge about, and therefore I'm an expert, therefore you will want my expertise and my product. But of course, Patterson worked out that can be really unsuccessful, especially with, think about, this is a cash register in 1894. It'd be like putting an iPad in front of them. So, you know, people were a bit intimidated by this whiz-bang machine, like it's early adoption stuff. So what he did is he convinced and then formalised a process of looking at business problems that mean we have a solution. Business problems that required a cash register. Now that was around theft, reconciling, stock taking, receipts, cash flow. It had nothing to do with the machine. All the stuff he eventually trained and formalised was all about finding the problems inherently in using a cash register or services and combining. Because you think this is coming out of an era where there was a lot of bartering going on. There was a lot of, I've got some raccoon skins and you're going to give me some cash. There was a give and take, a service mentality. But what he wanted to do was say, well, if you want my product, you've got to pay this certain cash and I'm going to collect it. But I'm also going to reconcile it against my stock and make a profit. So suddenly this business stuff started to come in. So he demanded that his salespeople had a level of business acumen. Mm-hmm. And that's where he started. And then he formalised that into the 4 parts. And of course, the 4 parts in the primer are the approach. So how you approach the sale, how you approach the prospective customer, the proposition. So how you propose, how you bring that together, the demonstration of your capability. And that's where your technical knowledge comes in, not at the start. Yeah, and then, of course, the close. Now, in those days, you know, you had to close. You had to ask for the business because not only did you have to do the first 3 steps, you actually had to ask people to put sort of, you know, their hand in their pocket and commit to some whiz-bang machine. So he formalised that into these 4 key steps, which he called the primer, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fascinating. And I say you've got the start there of the, you know, almost like the first sales process, really, or sales technique, and even to this day, and I think that has some benefit, although maybe some more complexity for some businesses. I just lost my train of thought there. Maybe it'll come back to me in a second.
Well, just while you're catching a thought, there's a fascinating little bit of insight that you just mentioned there. By doing this, Jason, he formalised it. Yep. He then, remember, he was a bit of a dictator. He was a hard man to work for. People functioned in this world and were very successful. He built reward clubs and the 100 Club and all this sort of stuff. But he also sacked a lot of people. Well, these people went out into the world, of course, and they spread the message. Because think about it, they had the first rigour and sort of, criteria around solution selling. So they took it to other businesses. And we know for a fact that one of his leaders, James Crane, or Crane, the ex-sort of president, he joined a little company called International Business Machines, which of course became IBM.
Absolutely.
Now, it was at IBM that he and Neil Rackerman came together of spin fame. So if you look at spin selling as we know it today, and I grew up with at Xerox, that solution selling vein, we can trace its DNA and origin back to Patterson and his people. Because these people went out into the world and cut their own way with their own businesses, making up the same sales system. So suddenly, if you actually think about it, he is the father of selling because all modern sales systems have come from his work.
all roads lead back, which is obviously why we're kicking this off today, Mike. And as I said, we'll do more pods off the back of this as well. Yeah, Mike, the train of thought, I was just going back to your previous comment as well, is that I think, again, what he was doing is moving to selling value and actually demonstrating return on investment. It wasn't about the price. It was about what value you're going to get from having this in your business and what's the return on investment. And I think that's another one for me. It's, there's no shortage of sales leaders and businesses talking about selling value and demonstrating return on investment. But, if I'm honest, I see very little evidence of people actually doing that in the field. I don't know if you have a view on that.
I was just looking at here at one of my notes. In the approach, salespeople made no mention of a cash register. Instead, they explained that they wanted to help the business owner find ways to increase profit.
Yeah.
After all, that's what they were in business for. In essence, the salesperson assumed the role of a consultant. Now, you look at our jobs day to day, and I think, wow, like that's the nut of it. But yet, you and I today see so many people still enter a sales conversation, starting with product knowledge. What am I here for? And then it turns into begging and, blind negotiation. It's just terrible. But and if you break it down, in its simplest form, he'd walk in, or his salespeople would walk into a merchant, a bartender, whatever, and say, how do you handle cash here? And of course, they'd look at him and go, what? Well, in between gunfights and fights and alcohol and all that, I get some cash and I give them drinks. And he says, yeah, but where does the cash go? And they pull out a wooden box or a shoe box. Is that what it just goes in here?
Put the hand in the pocket.
Yeah, that bit goes in. And no CCTV. They weren't watching it like they do today. And of course, he said, is there not a better way to increase? Like, how do you reconcile? And this was the killer question. He had a killer question. At the end of the night, how do you reconcile that you've got enough money for what you've given out in between all the chaos, gunfights and fighting? And the owner go, oh, I can't. And that's when they say, well, we've possibly got a solution to help that. Are you interested in it? So you can see the vein here, the narrative and the beautiful conversation is, let's find the problem and see whether it's big enough. But just by so happens, I have a solution to fix it. Oh, who would have thought, right? It's not trickery. It's just brilliant selling.
Yeah, and I think it's human nature, Mike, as well. I often use, the analogy of dating. If you go out on a date and all you do is talk about yourself for half an hour, guess what? You don't get a second date. You spend time talking about that person. Guess what? They want more and more and more, and eventually they want to know about you. So that's right. It's kind of the way we work as human beings, isn't it? So
well, and it gets. If you look at the proposition, if you go from the approach to the proposition, the salesperson described the register for the first time and explained how it would prevent theft and give accurate account of the day's receipts.
Yeah.
The goal of this stage was to schedule a demonstration of the machine nearby, and if they'd already installed one next door or down the street, they could do that. And then it was about closing. Well, you've got the machine. It's now giving you receipts. You've now got control of your profits. Do you want to buy it? Now, as Rackerman proved in Spin, the close is simple if you get the front part right. In actual fact, closing becomes a myth. It's not required. Absolutely. You still got to ask for the business. But this whole thing about closing, in my mind, and I'm on the record, closing's for smucks. If you do this really well at the start, you should never have to close. It should close itself.
Yeah, if you sell value,
I don't close. You don't close. I don't get it. I
think you're right, Mike. I think this whole it's the biggest challenge that I get. How do I get my team closing more? And I just my comment is that
get them opening more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and if you're selling value and you're selling, and even if you do get a challenge at the end, the simple deal with that is, can I just remind you the value you're getting from having this? What's the objection here? It's really, really simple.
It was quite interesting because then, of course, that then moved into if we're going to do this principle, if we're going to follow this approach, he had to train it, which comes back to his point. Salespeople are not born; they're trained. It's a learned skill, and yet you and I constantly see sales leaders and salespeople. We're working in organisations where they've had no formal training. The first question we ask in our scoping process is, tell me about the formal training you've had. And most of them have either read one book or been to some sort of ad hoc training. There's no formal training. And yet, this is the mechanism of the business that will inevitably give it its total profit. The sales team. the sales team will take it to market unless they're just a marketing organisation. So it staggers me that we put so much weight and priority on growing our top line sales, and yet we put so little effort and dollars into proper formal training. Yeah. And of course, matching that with coaching is the key. And Patterson was a very good coach. He arranged coaching in all his sales leaders. And that's how, of course, the whole Sugar Camp and Primer came together.
I was going to say, Mike, because I mean, you and I know, sales training can be a bit of a sheep dip exercise, and yes, you need to give people knowledge, but the key really is that ongoing coaching. And obviously, for sales leaders, then big part of what sales leaders should do is coach. So, was there from your insights? Sugar Camp was kind of, let's call it a sheep dip if you like, but what was the ongoing embedding of that knowledge and coaching to build the capability?
Well, they did a number of clever things. Then he set up a reward and recognition process, which, if you've worked at Xerox, you would know them as Par Club or President's Club, and then they had other clubs. But he had the 100 Club, the 300 Club. He had clubs, so he got people to aspire to go to the next level. So that was an important part. So he had the skills bit done, but he also tapped into mindset. Now, different era, of course, money was really important then. So base pays were really low, commissions were really high. Everything was on quota and territory. So he got them into territories, he had quotas, he gave reward and recognition, he gave them great sales training. So if you think about it, he created everything for success. And then what he did is he put in a layer of executive to make sure that they were led well, coached well, mentored, managed well. And again, different times, the 1800s, they probably bossed around a fair bit because it was a bit of a master and commander, master and controller type leadership style then. A lot different to today, of course. But if you think about, back to your point, if all you do is sales training, you'll fail. If all you do is skills and not deal with the mindset, the culture and the tools, which is our integral model, well, then you're going to be in real trouble. If I look at Patterson, he actually had the integral model, mindset, skill set, tool set, culture, nailed in every quarter of Sugar Camp. Yeah. And that's what he built. But he did it simply, Jason. Like, I'm looking at a photo here when he started a sales meeting. Remember, he was the first to run formal sales meetings in a structure. He invented the sales meeting, the proper one. But he started every sales meeting with a poster that just said, think. So the whole premise of a sales meeting was to think about what you've done, think about what you're going to do, think about how we can do it better, think about your wins, your losses, think about failure and learning from it. Everything revolved around one simple word, think. And there's a line here that I pulled out, a firm believer in teaching through the eye, using charts, graphs, drawings, or any other visual aid to get a point across to his sales force. Patterson told salespeople to use the same technique with prospects. So here's the beautiful bit. He trained them as he wanted them to behave. He purely trained them as he wanted them to behave. They come out into the field and replicate what he taught them at Sugar Camp. Now, how often do we see sales training that is completely incongruent with what the company's trying to achieve, let alone what the customer wants?
Absolutely. I think you're right. Teaching behaviour as opposed to just skills is vitally important.
Critically important. Yeah.
And for people listening to this, I think the interesting, the think bit, for me, what's fascinating is actually that's the origin of the iPad.
Yeah.
So for listening, the think was taken on by John's sales manager, then went on to found IBM and then created the ThinkPad. And then
that's right.
Apple took that on and took the think away and created the iPad. So yeah, incredible how all those things kind of lead back to that as well. I wanted to go back to that accountability bit briefly, Mike, before we finish today. But we talked a lot about he was a tough guy, he was very dictatorial. But actually, in this kind of world of, particularly as I said, we're filming this during coronavirus, where we're looking at more agile working. Actually, he was very forward thinking, not just in his things around sales, but I was reading that in his factories and in his offices, where he had lots of women working, they were allowed to work shorter hours because he recognised they had families and children to look after, and he had nurseries and creches so they could bring their children to work. I mean, that's incredibly forward thinking, even today, and he was doing that back in the 1800s.
He was the first to introduce daylight to factories. So he put glass in factories' windows because he discovered through Sugar Camp that when there was natural air and light, that people behave differently. Like, this is 1890. How did he even know?
Yeah.
But he followed his instincts. I think he's a very instinctive businessman. He bought employee benefits, as you say, creche, childcare to a factory, like it was unheard of at the time. And he was frowned upon. He was called a rebel and all sorts of things for doing it. He did some quite amazing things and he tried a lot of things, and he also failed. I think one of the things I'm sort of working on, and I know you are with customers at the moment, is you damn well got to be positive in COVID, and you have to have a crack. We have to have a go. You have to try some new things.
Absolutely.
But some of the old principles, and that's what we're going to cover over these next couple of months, sort of coming out of our version of Sugar Camp going forward, is what does history tell us? What are we doing today, but what should we do differently? Like, to me, that's what we're going to really focus on. And I made a bit of a hit list here. Nothing's changed around problems, just customer ones are bigger at the moment.
Yeah.
And not all business problems for salespeople are COVID problems. Be careful. Yeah. Systemization of sales. Never in history has sales process and systemization of sales process been so important. And we were talking just before we started this, I've had a bit of a win in the last couple of days, and I think about the things I did in reflection to achieve that. Yes, it was a little bit slower in sort of decision making, which you would expect considering the environment and economics. But I stuck to my process. I just stuck to my process, and I didn't waver on it. In fact, I dug in a little bit on it, which meant I'm sticking to our brand and what we stand for, our why, all that sort of stuff. So systemization of sales process is, if you don't have a visualized, documented sales process that everyone can follow, that's a big mistake.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing, there's a comment here, he created business people who sold. Notice this, I think this is a beautiful statement. Business people who sold. So they were trained to understand the business of being a merchant before the cash register. He then taught them about the power of the cash register, but to solve business problems first. Then he sent them out in the field to discover business problems first, and then sell the cash registers. So everything was aligned in what he did.
And that's just at the heart of the whole sales shift since 2008 that's accelerated, and I think is now with us in 2020. That, we've got to the point where salespeople are business people, they're advisors who can sell.
Yeah, absolutely.
We went out 100 years ago and then spent 100 years doing something different before we came back to it, which is kind of...
Yeah, and of course, technology and the internet's really unfolded his process here, but it's revealed how powerful it was, because everyone knows about product. Product's not special now. You can't be the expert on a product because everything's on the internet or YouTube. But you can be an expert at connecting that product with solving business problems for a customer. But the first step, as he discovered, is finding the business problem and shining a light on it.
Absolutely.
Now, he did that in the 1800s, and now it's more important than ever. Like, I think we're rolling back, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
The other thing that I want to touch on over the next months is the qualities of a salesman and the qualities of a sales leader. He documented that. He looked at it. He really looked at the behaviours, characteristics and skills of these two groups. And I think that's cool. Sales planning was massive. He, developed the first sales meeting, the first territory plans, the first reward plans. And then this use of clever, simplified marketing to make an impact. Yeah. And if I look at marketing today, it's become really complex, very hard to digest. We sort of think, well, we put a website up, that solves all our problem. We get a bit of SEO, we're okay. I just, less is more, get the message right.
Quality, yeah, less at higher quality. I think that's particularly B2B, Mike. I agree. Just constantly got a few more minutes, Mike. I just wanted to get your view on something about, going back to, I think, the toughness of Patterson, because, for me, I think he was tough in the right areas, and he definitely held people accountable. And I just think, why are business leaders, MDs, sales directors not holding people accountable nowadays like they were back then? It can't just be an era thing, can it, or is it?
I think there is a bit of that. I think we live in a world where we've backed off for whatever reason culturally around goal orientation. And you and I both know that goal orientation in sales and sales leadership especially is absolutely critical. Targets, KPIs, all that sort of thing. But, when I was doing sales management, in the field, it was like I could set them. I could say to Jason, you've got a target, you've got to hit this, and I'll help you get there. So there's that coaching bit. So I can set you a target, but if I don't coach you and help you to get it.
Yeah.
I remember, Jason, when I first sat down with a very good friend of mine at Xerox. He was my first sales leader and probably the best one I ever had, TD. He knows who he is if he hears this. He sat down and he said, Boyley, he said, you've got a $10 million target. I went, and I said, what? And he said, don't worry, I've got your back. I'll work out how we do that because every day there's certain things you've got to do and I'll work with you and you can do it. And here's the key. You might get one deal worth 10 million and then you can sort of lay around the beach. So you can put in as much as you want or not to this gig to get your target. The key is if you're only going to do one deal, you better make sure you get everything right so you get it. and I remember thinking, that's not going to work. I need to pace this out. I need to be structured. I need to be planned. I need to be organised. I need to be effectual. But in essence, what he was saying is, yes, you need all those things and we're going to help you with that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to coach you. I'm going to train you. So I think the problem really lies in we've got a culture that's not so accountable and doesn't like ownership.
Yeah.
That's why we've probably got a lot of resilience problems at the moment. But we've also got a poorly trained and ill-equipped sales management executive.
Yeah.
Now you think about, you and I have that question, where did you get your sales management degree, Mr. Sales Manager, when we first meet them? And they all go, well, I didn't. Well, of course I didn't. It's a mischievous question. There is no, especially in Australia, different in the US. But so they're coming off such a low base. What worries me, Jason, about the sales leaders of today and their ability to coach is they don't have the tools to do it and they don't have the confidence. So therefore they're hiding behind that dark art of sales and that wall is coming down. That wall's definitely coming down. Yeah. So they're gonna have to get up and learn how to coach, learn how to performance manage, learn how to have hard conversations. You and I do this quite regularly. And we sit with leaders that go, how did you do that? Well, it was pretty simple with a structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, giving that tough feedback. But you're right, it's great salespeople become sales leaders, but the job's a different job. You can't just rely on your experience. And I think people are pretty implicit about what they expect people to achieve, but then there's no support to nurture those people through from the leader. So I think it's some really interesting insight there, Mike. Just conscious of time, Mike, and I'd say we want to keep these short and punchy. I think that was some great insights around Patterson and some of the things that were happening back then. And as you said, we'll expand on some of those areas over the coming weeks and months around, problem solving, selling, process, marketing that cuts through and works, planning, business people that sell, all the stuff you mentioned. We'll pick up on that over the coming podcast. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us. Great to talk to you as always, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Jason. Good to talk about it.